Elden Ring was one of my most anticipated games of all time, and I finally got the chance to play the game, and I've spent almost 120 hours in my first playthrough, not because I was struggling constantly, but because I wanted to explore everything the game had to offer for me. I saw guides, and I wanted to do questlines, explore multiple areas, and also fight almost anything the game has to do when it comes to its bosses. I was already pretty familiar with the FromSoft formula. I've played the trilogy of Dark Souls, I've completed Bloodborne 3 times, and I've also played Sekiro. Elden Ring was the only one that I was missing, and I haven't played Demon Souls yet. This is the only one that's currently missing when it comes to the newer formula of FromSoft games. And when the game came out, I couldn't help myself but look at many of the stuff that was going on with it. Before I would even play the game, I was familiar with many of its areas, many of its main bosses, and I knew a lot of things about it. And I already convinced myself that I'm going to love this game. I mean, I already love everything that I've played from FromSoft, and I got really excited just looking at everything this game had to offer. So for the very first time when it comes to video games, I ended up getting the collector's edition, which includes this gorgeous statue of Malenia, the Blade of Miquella, that you can see right up there, and it also comes with many other cool stuff. You have an entire art book over here, you have the disc, you have a steelbook version, you have a poster, you have a patch, and you also have the soundtrack, which obviously you can easily get access to it on Spotify. It's not like it's hard getting access to the soundtrack, but I honestly kinda just dig it just having it in my library. So I was like, okay, since I've already done this with Bloodborne, why not do it with Elden Ring and make a tier list of the soundtrack? I mean, when it comes to tier list of the bosses, there are already so many videos and tier lists regarding this topic. Not that I'm not interested in doing it, I would love talking about the bosses, but I don't really believe that there are many people talking about the soundtrack or making a tier list of the soundtrack. At least I haven't found anything like this. So before we get to the tier list, I want to talk briefly about my opinion when it comes to the soundtrack of those games, because I actually don't believe this is one of the biggest strengths when it comes to those games. I believe that there are certainly some really interesting ideas when it comes to some of those soundtracks, and I believe that they have managed to create some phenomenal songs and some that would be pretty iconic when it comes to like orchestral pieces on game soundtracks, but I believe that it's with a small margin of those, as for the most part I believe that we get a formula that is pretty standard and kinda basic. The one game that kinda changed that was Sekiro, which went for an entirely different aesthetic, which in my opinion worked in some aspects. But for me, FromSoft games have some of their best soundtracks when it comes to their more atmospheric pieces, the ones that are not focused on boss fights but rather just like hub area themes. I believe that these are some of the most iconic themes they have created and some of their most imaginative ones. Like when it comes to my mind, what are some of the best soundtracks out of FromSoft games? Some of the first that come to mind are Majula or Farleg's Shrine or Gwyn, themes that are not really epic but focus more on atmosphere, and I believe that this is some of their best, some of their strongest when it comes to soundtracks, which puts Elden Ring in a pretty interesting position, because for the first time we see a more accessible approach when it comes to how they handle music, because if you remember the past FromSoft games, with the exception of Sekiro, you would most likely never have soundtracks when just going around the environment. I mean, it has become a meme how for such a long time you might roam around with no music playing, and then you get into a big room, and then you hear the boss music, and you know like, oh shit, it's happening, we're getting into a boss fight. I mean, it is part of the appeal, but I believe that it makes for a lot of empty space, which could have been easily filled with some atmospheric soundtracks. We saw this happening slightly with certain portions out of Bloodborne, which for me was a very welcome change and made for some of the most interesting themes out of the entire project as well. Sekiro also tried this, but in my opinion they didn't really do that much of a great job with it. I personally was hoping that they would do even more when it came to this style and this particular aesthetic, but in my opinion, it wasn't really all that captivating for the most part. Not only that, but the mixing was very weird at points. I remember that there were occasions where you would have some of the more intense themes come to play when you're engaged in combat, and you might trigger an NPC dialogue, and the music would just basically completely cover the dialogue. It had a few issues like that, but when it comes to Elden Ring, it seems that they understood that they can actually put music out of those traversal moments, and in my opinion it actually makes for some of the most compelling stuff FromSoft have ever put out. It actually makes for a big part of the game, as for a very long period of time you're just going to explore stuff. So even if I personally believe that Elden Ring doesn't have some of the most captivating themes, I believe that Bloodborne is still the best. Some of those additions with the more dark ambient themes are what makes this potentially my second favorite soundtrack out of everything that I've played from FromSoftware this far. And now, with all that being said, let's jump into the tier list. Thankfully, it seems that there is someone that created this tier list, so I don't have to make one on my own. So I basically found this tier list. I've already did this once, and I put them in this new category over here where I put all of the tracks in order, because even that was incorrect. The tracks were not in order. And so we have the tier list over here, with S tier being the ones that I would consider to be 10 out of 10s, the tracks that I would consider to be some of the best FromSoft have put out ever. And then we have D tier as the final one, the worst ones, because I don't believe that there is anything out of the soundtrack that I would categorize as an F tier. There's not something about the soundtrack that I find particularly bad. It's just certain tracks that I would feel that are just simply forgettable and not really doing that much for me, or really remembering them that much out of the soundtrack. So now, starting off, we have the starting theme, which is Elden Ring. I believe that this is one of the most interesting and one of the better starting themes that we get out of these games. I believe that it starts in a pretty interesting tone, as it has this fan service when it comes to those piano portions that are quite reminiscent of what we got with Gwyn, Lord of Cinder, but this is just for a very small portion and then it instantly becomes quite epic. I believe that when it starts, it actually feels kinda basic and generic. I wasn't really feeling it all that much. At first it feels more of like a royalty-free epic music collage, and it starts with those string arrangements is where the track actually ends up becoming kinda beautiful. A bit of a short idea. I like that it doesn't really overstage welcome, as there's not really that much that you can do on the menu screen, and it doesn't really overstage welcome, just like what happens with Dark Souls 3 for example. This is short and simple, and I believe that it contains some pretty interesting ideas to it. So overall I'd say that Elden Ring goes the A tier. The opening. Now this basically plays in the very first cutscene of the game. This is more of like a cinematic piece that, without the attachment of the video or the narration behind it, it basically feels completely pointless. I get it why they would include it in the soundtrack, as it was made specifically for this occasion, but it's like the same thing as like having trailer music without basically watching the trailer or having any narration attached to it. It feels empty and it doesn't really do anything particularly interesting in this regard. So I'm gonna give it a D tier because it doesn't really serve as anything interesting on its own. Character creation. Now, I was a bit disappointed by this because I believe that they've actually done some pretty cool stuff when it comes to character creation themes. Obviously, nothing tops the theme out of Dark Souls 1. This one might be my least favorite. I really don't remember anything out of it. I believe that it's a very uninteresting piece. So yeah, I'm just gonna give it a D tier. Nothing particularly interesting about that. Limgrave. This is where things get really interesting in my opinion. I absolutely love this theme, not just because I was listening to it multiple times, just traversing through Limgrave, which by its own is a huge area and there is just so much things to do, which has this feeling that it's a really beautiful and gorgeous place, but there is obviously something really eerie and menacing about it, mainly because everything is out there to attack you. There is this alienating feel to it, which comes in contrast with how gorgeous this whole place looks. Now, I really like this theme because it reminds me a lot of Firelink Shrine out of the first Dark Souls, which in my opinion is one of the best soundtracks they've ever put out. And Limgrave has many similar ideas when it comes to its overall composition and how it's structured. It has this huge empty space to it, and you just have those airy string arrangements that feel a little bit monotone and just come in certain occasions. It feels like a really nice build up, even though it doesn't really build up to anything. It's just such beautiful and weirdly haunting atmosphere that in my opinion is some of the best aspects when it comes to the soundtrack of Elden Ring, and in my opinion they nailed it with this one. This is gonna be my first and actually one of the very few S tiers. I really love this theme. I believe that this contains one of the biggest strengths when it comes to the soundtrack of Elden Ring or FromSoft games in general. It has a really iconic feel to it, and in my opinion it works beautifully. The caves was somewhat uninteresting, even though there are lots of caves out of the game. It was one of the side dungeon themes that didn't really do that much for me. I kinda dig the dark ambience behind it, but in my opinion it doesn't really do that much to justify what is going on, because it feels kinda empty and not really providing all that much. So for me, caves is more like a drony dark ambient piece that doesn't really go anywhere. It feels kinda forgettable, and I don't really believe there's that much to it. It has some cool elements, so I'm gonna give it a C tier, but it's definitely not one of the highlights, not even close. Tunnels is somehow even worse. There's just so much of empty space that for the most part I even forget that there is a theme playing when it comes to those dungeons, and that's not really a good sign. I don't believe that it does many things that are remotely interesting when it comes to its compositions, if you can really say that there is that much of a composition behind it. Like, it tries to create this dark, haunting and monotone feel, but it kinda falls flat to its face. It's definitely not one of my favorite themes. I'm gonna give this a D right here. Stormveil Castle. Now this is another one of those ambient themes that in my opinion contains some of the strengths of Elden Ring soundtrack. One that is kinda similar to Limgrave, but it focuses a bit more on the low end of string arrangements. What I particularly enjoy about Stormveil Castle is the balance with the eerie atmosphere that this track provides. When you traverse the inner sections or the outside of the castle, it never really gets the feel that it's becoming way too claustrophobic in order to fit with the moments where you traverse towards the more tight corridors of the castle, nor it feels that it works for a more open space like Limgrave. It also has a lot of empty space to it. There is a bit of a tension with how haunting it can be at times, and I really like this as a composition. I believe that it has some of the more interesting ideas out of the game, but I don't believe it's one of my favorites because there's another idea which is really similar to Stormveil Castle that we're gonna see much later, that in my opinion contains a much stronger and more standout composition. For what it is, Stormveil Castle earns an A tier spot because it is a really solid theme. The roundtable hold, in my opinion, unfortunately was somewhat disappointing when it comes to the soundtrack at least, because when it comes to hub areas, this is where you would most likely expect the best soundtracks. The entire Dark Souls trilogy and Bloodborne had phenomenal soundtracks when it comes to their hub area. I mean, yeah, main exception is gonna be Sekiro. It was really forgettable. I was expecting a bit more out of Roundtable Hold, honestly. I mean, it didn't really help, even in the context of the game, how detached it felt with the rest of the map. There were some really cool stuff and NPC interactions at Roundtable Hold, but I'd say that this is possibly my least favorite hub area, with Sekiro as well, because I felt a lot of disconnect out of it, and unfortunately it didn't really help that the soundtrack out of it was somewhat forgettable. It has some nice mellow and dramatic moments, but never to the point where it feels like it does something all that memorable or striking or that much engaging. For the most part, it feels like a kinda basic composition that doesn't really do all that much. I believe that it's a nice theme, don't get me wrong, I believe that it's a good song, but you would honestly expect much more out of a hub area theme out of these games. When it comes to ambient themes while traversing the environment, the true masterpiece is not Limgrave, it's actually Liurnia of the Lakes. This is an easy S tier and possibly my favorite theme out of the entire game. Luring of the Lakes is a massive area and there is so much things to do to it. Like, it is insane how, basically I'd say that this is possibly the biggest area out of the game, and while playing this it was insane how while doing multiple NPC interactions, especially when it comes to the running quest line, I would see myself constantly coming back to this place. And every time this very first note plays, it always creates this beautiful feeling because we're talking about a gorgeous place that contains a soundtrack that is once again somewhat horrifying and depressing, and after a certain point seeing yourself coming back to this place again and again and again, this melody when it starts just ends up becoming so chilling. There is something very weirdly ominous and fascinating about this theme that in my opinion very few soundtracks have managed to do this same way. Obviously this is another one of those tracks where you are going to see a lot of empty space, but I believe that this more ambient electronic direction with all of those synth sections works tremendously over here with a very beautiful and compelling composition, and one that is also one of the best when it comes to its pacing from start to finish. This is an excellent theme. The Great Underground Rivers is the theme that plays when you go to the underground areas of the game, which honestly it's a bit more haunting than what I would expect. I mean, it kinda makes sense as we're talking about underground areas, but it comes in a bit of a contrast with its very gorgeous landscape, especially when it comes to the sky that has this incredible sort of futuristic purple color to it. And I don't know, I would expect something that would feel a little bit more dreamy and not necessarily all that nightmarish. As an idea, I believe that it's pretty decent, but I honestly was expecting a little bit more out of it. It was certainly not one of my favorite ideas when it comes to those more ambient sections of the game, so I'm gonna give it a B tier. Eternal City has quite a few similarities with Great Underground Rivers. I mean, we're talking about another underground area that is in like great connection, but you don't really do that much in Eternal City. Unfortunately, it's not one of the longest legacy dungeons that you're gonna see throughout the game, and there is not really that much to resonate with this track in particular. It focuses a bit more on string arrangements, but they're not really all that interesting. I believe that it's just a decent theme, but it feels more of like background noise rather than just something that can become potentially exceptional. The Academy of Rare Lucaria is one of those tracks that in my opinion starts pretty strong, but then as it goes on, it doesn't really do that much to justify its pacing. It's something that it's the case with quite a lot of tracks when it comes to FromSoft games. You're gonna really remember the very first notes and then it kinda becomes a theme that just plays in the background, but still I believe that Academy of Rare Lucaria has some really interesting ideas. It has some similar sounds with Luring of the Lakes, which is awesome, and I believe that it does some pretty decent job when it comes to creating this magical atmosphere that the Academy provides. It's a really beautiful and magical place, and this is also a theme that in my opinion actually is pretty good. It's one of the better themes out of the game. I believe that it has some really interesting ideas to it, and I'm just gonna give it an A tier. I believe that there are some really interesting aspects about it. Now, if we were to compare K-Lead with the themes of Limgrave and Luring of the Lakes, K-Lead actually slightly disappointed me. It feels quite fitting having this more horrifying undertone to it, as we're talking about the most disturbing area in the game when it comes to those larger areas. It is quite disturbing. It has some of the most disturbing designs when it comes to monsters, and the whole area, it's just this really devastating wasteland, and so it feels kind of fitting for K-Lead having more of this like tremolo play in the string sections, which is pretty usual when it comes to horror theme sounds, but the dark ambience out of it gets stale quite fast, and it doesn't really have that many melodic aspects that would make it kinda stand out. So at the end of the day, it feels more of like just playing in the background without providing something that much more captivating to it, which is a bit of a shame because I believe that there are some really interesting ideas about this track and it is pretty fitting for the area, but it's certainly not one of my favorites. Remember when I said that there is a much better version of Stormveil Castle? Well, it's right here, Old Castle. When you go through the multiple castles, this is the theme that plays, and while it's pretty similar with what Stormveil Castle does with its composition and its structure and its arrangements, I believe that over here it works much better because it contains a very gorgeous part towards the end, which is really captivating and actually one of my favorite moments when it comes to this entire soundtrack. It's a moment where the instrumentation gets a little bit louder than usual, it adds more layers to it than before, and it makes for a great conclusion. So for me, Old Castle is actually an S tier, the track that I really adore, and I believe that it has some very cool moments to it when it comes to its overall structure. Altus Plateau is possibly the saddest theme over here. It is kinda depressing just watching this whole place being in the state that it is, because you can tell that this was once a very glorious and very beautiful place, but what was once a legendary area is now filled with ruins and the long-lasting effects of great wars happening here. Now this is a track over here that in my opinion contains some of the best ideas out of the entire game, especially when it comes to a part towards the end where it feels like the tone down section of the strings build up for something, but then it just becomes this really mellow and dramatic theme that just creates a very gorgeous, very sad and very mellow atmosphere that in my opinion works tremendously over here. Altus Plateau is a very powerful and impactful theme, but in my opinion this is not something that happens with the entirety of it. Unfortunately, I believe that the pacing is not as strong. It has certain moments that didn't really manage to captivate me as much as it happened with Limgrave and Leonie of the Lakes, which in their entirety managed to keep me hooked. Still, we're talking about one of the best themes over here, that's for sure, and I'm gonna give it a very strong A tier. Catacombs is possibly my favorite theme when it comes to the side dungeons. The Catacombs give me a strong vibe of the challenge dungeons out of Bloodborne, which were pretty similar in aesthetic and with some of the traps that they would put, and it also had a bit of a similar theme. I like how horrifying this is with all of the choral parts, and it's a pretty cool dark ambient track. Certainly not one of the most standout moments out of this whole soundtrack, but I believe that it deserves a strong B tier. I believe that this is one of the better themes when it comes to this more eerie dark ambient aesthetic. Leyndell Royal Capital contains pretty similar ideas with what we get with Altus Plateau, but it also doesn't contain some of its strong highs. I believe that Leyndell is a pretty interesting theme. It starts in a really nice tone, and I like how this one also has this more depressing feel to it, just watching at this beautiful place that you can tell that it has been pretty much ruined, and you don't really see the glorious place that it once was, although it's still a very beautiful place. Just by listening to this soundtrack you can tell that they're building a huge story behind this place, and it's amazing how much there is to explore in Leyndell. It's definitely possibly like my favorite area out of the game. Unfortunately though, I wouldn't say that this is one of the most standout themes that they've done. Actually, I just believe that it's a pretty decent piece. There are some really cool moments to it, but it's certainly not one of those tracks that I would say were the most memorable for me. Subterranean Sudden Grouch at first feels more of like I'm listening to a military theme, in the sense that I was getting a kinda similar vibe with compositions out of the very first Medal of Honor games, which were superb soundtracks by the way, don't get me wrong. But yeah, I don't know, I just believe it's an interesting theme, it has a strong introduction to it, it doesn't really go in something that much more captivating as it goes on, but yeah, whatever, it's just a decent theme. I believe that it does its job well done for the place that it's placed at. Mount Gelmir unfortunately has one of the most uninteresting and most forgettable soundtracks when it comes to open areas, which at this point you would mostly get consistently great tracks, and Mount Gelmir just comes and it's not really all that interesting. Even when it comes to the area, I don't really believe that it was that much exceptional. There was not really a lot that you could do in Mount Gelmir. It's not bad, it has some cool moments to it, but yeah, I'm just gonna give it like a C tier. Volcano Manor serves as like a second hub area, which I'd say it's a pretty interesting concept, and I really liked the whole vibe and the aesthetic out of Volcano Manor. In a sense, a little bit even more than the original hub area, even though obviously there's not really that much content to it, and unfortunately it doesn't even have that much of an interesting soundtrack either. It's a bit better than Mount Gelmir, but yeah, it wasn't really one that struck my attention all that much. I'm gonna give it a C tier. I believe that it was just kinda decent. Prison Town, yeah, I barely even remember this. I listened to it in the soundtrack and I was like, was this really part of the game? Where was it? Like, I couldn't even remember it. Yeah, very typical bland, uninteresting, like dark ambient theme. There's not really much to it. Yeah, D tier, nothing really interesting about it. Mountaintops of the Giants, easily one of my favorite themes when it comes to those more ambient soundtracks. Beautiful compositions, some of the keys, the moments they play made for a really satisfying feel because listening to the way this composition was gonna go, I was expecting that it was gonna hit these particular notes as it would go on, and it really satisfied me when the track was playing exactly the way I was hoping it would. So yeah, Mountaintops of the Giants, easily one of the better themes out of the game. I really like this. I believe that this is a really good theme. Divine Tower, actually one of my favorite tracks in the game. I'm not even kidding. There is something weirdly cheerful about this track for me. It's like this sense of accomplishment when you get into a Divine Tower, like you managed to do something, and it's definitely one of the most unique and intriguing when it comes to its instrumentation. It feels kinda different compared to what the rest of the soundtrack goes at, with the constant bell sounds, the very subtle guitar plugs, lots of interesting elements that personally makes this one of my favorite themes out of the game. Crumbling Farm Azula is one of those multiple cases where you have a track that starts pretty strong in a really iconic tone, but as it goes on it doesn't really become all that memorable. And it has some pretty interesting and cool ideas throughout, but we're talking about one of the longest moments over here. It goes for almost 4 minutes, and it doesn't really have that much going on to it in order to justify its length. In my opinion, it could have been cut into something that would be a little bit more straightforward and focus a bit more into those piano elements that you get towards the beginning, which sound really good. The ambience out of it is definitely pretty nice. It makes for one of the more intriguing and unique themes out of this whole soundtrack, but at the end of the day, I'm just gonna give it a strong B tier. Consecrated Snowfield is unfortunately very disappointing. This track is contained in my personal least favorite area of the game, especially like when it comes to open areas. It's like Frigid Outskirts, but much better because nothing tops how bad Frigid Outskirts was. But Consecrated Snowfields also doesn't have that much of an interesting soundtrack. It's just a really forgettable theme, and unfortunately there's not something that much to do in the area. It's just a song that plays in the background, and that's basically it. So yeah, I'm just gonna give it a D tier. Nothing particularly interesting about it. Mikila's Haligtree, it's beautiful. I mean, it sounds nice. It has a nice sound to it, but apart from that, yep. Not really one of the most memorable moments when it comes to the more ambient themes. I believe that it's just a passing, nice, beautiful theme that doesn't really do that much other than just being a quite nice song to just have in the background. Elfel is kind of the same. It's another track that, in my opinion, it's kinda beautiful but also kinda forgettable. Not really feeling it all that much. It's just an okay idea. I'm gonna give it like a strong C. Like at this point I don't believe that there is that much to say about those particular songs, and especially when it comes to those ones. These ones are basically just really generic songs when you engage in fights, which in my opinion they're not really all that interesting. They sound pretty generic, they sound pretty standard, and for the most part they're really forgettable, so we're gonna get into them really fast because there's not really that much to talk about them. Formidable Foe 1 is D tier. I don't really remember this track playing all that much. I mean, it definitely played at some parts, but I was just that much focused to the fight that it just got completely like forgettable. Don't really remember it all that much, and even listening it with the context of the soundtrack, it wasn't really all that interesting. Formidable Foe 2, on the other hand, is much better. It's actually one of the more memorable themes when it comes to those invasion type soundtracks. I actually kinda like the ideas out of it a little bit more. It was a bit interesting. I'm gonna give it a B tier. I remember I'm actually kinda liking this idea a lot. Invader, another track that in my opinion was completely forgettable. Not really much to say about it. It just passes out as a really forgettable track when it comes to just like fighting thieves. I'm just gonna give it a D. Old Warriors, again, don't really remember it all that much. I believe it was a bit more interesting compared to some other songs over here. I'm gonna give it a low C tier. Murder Nights. This is where we actually get into the good stuff when it comes to like post themes. This one actually starts really intense. It is really epic. It has some very nice vocal passages. It's one of the better ideas over here. I really like how intense and how powerful it is, and I believe that for the most part it contains some pretty cool compositions. I'd say that this is an A tier. It's definitely one of the better ones when it comes to this type of sound. Fallen Knights starts kinda strong. It has potential to it, at least it seemed like it had potential to it, but why is this track 6 minutes long? It's almost 6 minutes long and I don't get why. Like, it overstays its welcome, it doesn't really have that much to it in order to justify this length. I believe that it's interesting as a little bit of a more unique idea, as it kinda reminds me more of like a militaristic theme. It fits a bit with this more epic orchestral sound, and it has some good moments to it, like the way it begins. This is basically the theme that you get when you fight Element of the Briar and when you fight the Bell-Bearing Hunters and Knights Cavalry. You're gonna hear this sound quite a few times, and I believe that it makes for a really nice introduction point, pumping you up. But listening to it in the context of the soundtrack, it wasn't really all that good because it was going on for so long and I don't really get why. Like, it doesn't really progress into something that much more compelling. The pacing is not really that much there. Still, quite a good idea. I'm gonna give it a B. The Murd is, if I remember correctly, the theme that plays when you get into the Evergels, which the Evergels are pretty inconsistent. They contain some of my favorite fights and also some of my least favorites. So yeah, they were a bit all over the place. Unfortunately, the soundtrack, I believe it's just kinda decent. It doesn't really have something that much powerful or captivating to it. I mean, it has intensity, but for the most part, it's kinda basic, and I believe that it serves simply as a pretty decent moment. Yeah, not really much more to it other than that. I believe that it's just a decent passable moment. The Accursed, on the other hand, I vaguely remember this one. Yeah, it's kinda intense, it's kinda haunting, it has this threatening aura to it, like something is coming towards you, but I mean, it's not really something all that interesting. I'm gonna give it a low C. Grave Wardens, a theme that possibly plays when you fight a boss in dungeons or something. I believe that in the context of the game, it felt quite fitting, but listening to it by itself, it's really forgettable. No, this is just a T tier, nothing really all that interesting. Same with Death's Kindred, it basically suffers from some of the same problems. I'm just gonna put it like at D tier as well. I'm sounding like a broken record at this point. I mean, I can't really say that much for those songs in particular. Not really anyone cares that much about them. Let's go to some more interesting stuff. We have Dragon. Actually, one of my favorite things about the Dragon fights, even though they do admittedly become quite repetitive and samey, I actually like the soundtrack a lot. I believe that it's definitely one of the greatest aspects about these fights. The very first interaction that you have with Dragon, at least for me, was like in Ladle, where you have this big river and then all of a sudden a huge dragon appears. That was a really cool moment, and what made this moment even cooler is this really epic soundtrack that comes into place. Like, this is a really beautiful theme, and it's also really short and straight to the point. It doesn't really go into that many directions, so it's actually kinda easy to pinpoint all of the elements that it has to it and how it progresses and how it's structured. It's easy to digest in comparison to a lot of other themes, especially as we go later towards the list, where I believe that they just become really lengthy for no apparent reason and they miss their magic. Dragon is short and straight to the point, and it contains some of my favorite ideas out of this whole soundtrack. Dragon is an easy A tier. It's one of the most epic moments out of this whole project. Falling Star Beast is one of my favorite fights in the entire game. I love fighting those foes. Now, when it comes to the soundtrack, it has a bit of a similar vibes when it comes to like, what was it, Fallen Knights? I believe it was Fallen Knights. It feels kinda similar, having this militaristic feel to it. I mean, it feels like it's marching towards you. I like the instrumentation out of this. I believe that it's pretty interesting and it makes for one of the more unique and intriguing themes that you get out of the soundtrack. However, it doesn't really have that much of a great pacing to it and just becoming that much of a memorable thing from start to finish. I believe that it sounds good, but it's not really one of my strongest highlights, even though the fight itself is pretty awesome. And it has a soundtrack that is kind of easy to remember for just sounding a little bit different than usual, so I'm gonna give it a B tier. Red Wolf of Radagon, not only was it a kinda disappointing fight, like I was expecting a little bit more out of it, like watching it prior to playing the game, but I got into it and I thought that it was kinda easy and a little bit of an uninteresting fight. I didn't even know that Red Wolf of Radagon had its own soundtrack. It just came by like a really forgettable one. So yeah, I believe that it's definitely one of the weaker ones when it comes to boss themes. I mean, you have occasions where you get intense, epic and grandiose boss themes that end up not really doing that much and sounding kinda basic and generic, and this is unfortunately one of the main examples I can think of. R3 Avatar, again, like I said, very similar to R3 Nights, but it doesn't really have that much of the intensity or the impact of like this track over here, even though we're talking about some similar ideas. I feel that it would possibly feel a little bit different if it was like the track listing being placed in like a different position, but still a really solid boss theme and a really solid boss in general. I really liked fighting the R3 avatars. I believe that they're really cool fights and they have a really strong theme to them. Alright, here we go, the moment that most of you were possibly been waiting for, Godskin Apostles. I mean, I believe that this is pretty obvious. This is an S tier, without a doubt. This is one of the most epic, one of the greatest, and one of the most badass themes they have ever done when it comes to boss fights. Which is insane thinking that they decided to make some of the best themes for fighting Godskin Apostle and Godskin Noble. It is epic, it is really memorable, the choral parts sound incredible, and it's one of the best tracks when it comes to pacing. There are so many cool elements to it and it doesn't stop just sounding and feeling awesome. The fights themselves are great and this soundtrack is just the icing on the cake. It's so good. So I personally don't complain that I had to fight Godskin Apostle and Godskin Noble so many times because I got to listen to this awesome soundtrack again. I love this theme. Yep, this is an easy S tier, and this is definitely the best theme that they've done in Elden Ring when it comes to a boss fight. Black Knives, unfortunately, kinda an interesting boss and kinda an interesting soundtrack. It goes into a more of like dark undertone, threatening vibes. It's not like that much of an intense or epic theme, which kinda fits with the whole way the Black Knife assassins kinda approach you and try to attack you, just being really sneaky and finding great opportunities. Most of the time you fight them at the end of the dungeon, so it makes for a fight that won't usually have a soundtrack that it's like really epic or grandiose, but I don't believe that it does all that much with the atmosphere that it creates. I believe that it could have been better. There was potential for more. I just gonna give it a C tier. It was not really all that interesting. Market the Fell Omen, the first remembrance boss that you fight, possibly, but yeah, the thing with Margit is that it's a really good fight. I really like the fight with Margit, even though it didn't really take me all that much, that many tries in comparison to what I thought it would, because everyone was calling this an extremely difficult fight or whatever. I don't know, I find it to be a kinda decent enemy. It was kinda hard, but not really all that hard. The thing is though that I didn't really get to appreciate, I'd say, the soundtrack all that much, but listening to it more in the context of like the whole album and stuff, I actually don't believe it's all that great. Unfortunately, when it comes to one of the fights that they've put the most focus, like out of everything we've had so far, with possibly the exception of Koskin Apostles, this is the fight, like this is the first cutscene you get from a boss fight. You would expect like they would go all out in creating an incredible soundtrack, and I don't really believe that we get that. It sounds really generic. At first glance I was really disappointed with how much the Margit theme was just passing by. So yeah, I don't believe that it's an awful song, but I was certainly expecting more for a fight like Margit, but I don't really believe we got that. I'm just gonna give it a C tier. Omen Illusion, I have forgotten where this plays, but I remember it being a good song, like listening to it with the context of the soundtrack. This is a pretty cool idea. I believe that it has some strong elements to it that actually sound very nice. I don't believe it's something particularly all that amazing, but I remember really digging this one. I forget where I've listened to it, in which boss fight it was. But yeah, Omen Illusion, it's a really cool song. Lord's Apparition, kind of a nice epic choral theme, like the vocal layers out of this one. It's short and sweet, but that's pretty much about it. There's not really that much more you can say about it. It's a C tier. Regal Ancestor Spirit is undoubtedly one of the best themes out of this entire game. It has a very different aesthetic to it, going into a direction of like Nordic themes that kind of fits with the whole aesthetic that it creates, and I believe that they did a pretty good job with this particular track, just making it feel different in comparison to all of the classical themes that we get out of the game. It is one of those tracks that in my opinion fits really well when it comes to a boss fight, and it makes for one of my favorite moments, because we're not talking about an epic theme, we're talking about a very mellow, sad and dramatic one that fits very nicely with the whole aesthetic that the Ancestor Spirit creates, fighting it in this arena, in the state that it is, with its whole design. There are so many things that work really well about this particular fight. So for me, Regal Ancestor Spirit is a low A tier because the pacing can be a little bit off at times. I don't think that it keeps its strong elements all the way through. I like that it starts with some similar notes with Altos Plateau, but it plays in a completely different instrumentation and style. I like the way it all blends together, and the soundtrack also helps for making this one of the most standout fights in the entire game. Astel, Natural Born of the Void. What a gorgeous boss, undoubtedly one of my favorite fights in the game, even if mechanically the fight is not really that much engaging. It's not like one of the best or most mind-blowing fights when it comes to the whole combat style, but when it comes to design, presentation, it's definitely some of the best and most imaginative stuff FromSoft have ever put out. The soundtrack is definitely one of the most beautiful ones as well. It goes into a closer direction with the aesthetics that we got with Regal Ancestor Spirit, although for me the pacing on this one is even weaker. It doesn't really have that many highs, but still it keeps on being one of the more dramatic and mellow themes that works for what it is. I'm gonna give it a solid B tier. I believe that there are some really cool things about this fight. I believe that this particular soundtrack fits for the whole aesthetic of Astel, and yeah, it's a really interesting one, I'd say the least. Yeah, so for basically Ancient Dragon Landsex, whatever it's pronounced, Not only is it the most annoying and the most frustrating dragon fight out of the entire game, they also decided to put a different soundtrack to it, which feels like a toned out version of what Dragon over here managed to achieve. This one just tries something a bit different, but doesn't really work all that well in my opinion. I mean, it's still a really good theme, but I'm just gonna give it a B tier. I believe that it's just pretty decent. Lich Dragon 46 is one of the coolest fights out of the entire game, especially when it comes to dragon fights. This one is spectacular when it comes to its spectacle. This soundtrack is really epic, but it's another moment that in my opinion overstays its welcome. It's a really long theme and I don't really understand why, but my god, what are we talking about? One of the most epic themes over here. Like, this one is over the top in some occasions, I'd say. And it kind of works really well. I mean, we're talking about a really epic fight. You're fighting a dragon that has a really cool moveset. And I like that they did something a bit different with this particular fight of a dragon rather than just sticking with a theme that we've heard before. I mean, it is a very special dragon, but I believe that what holds it back is that, like I said, it's longer than what it needs. It feels like they tried to do a lot with this track, but it wasn't all that much necessary in my opinion. I'm gonna give it a B. Song of Lament, if I remember correctly, this one was sung by a specific type of bats, and this is basically a very short like interlude a cappella where you have something like being sung in Latin language. It's interesting. Honestly, I'd say it's better than a big portion out of those songs over here, which kind of surprising, but yeah, this interlude over here sounds more interesting. And I remember the first time listening to this, I was like, whoa, where does it come from? Which the game had many surprises like this. A Song of Lament is decent. I mean, as its own, it doesn't really do that much. In the context of the game, yeah, it was quite nice. Morgoth the Omen King. Very epic, yes, very intense, indeed, but also not one of my favorite or the most memorable ones. I mean, when it comes to the fight itself, I actually beat it first try. I don't know, I was like really overpowered or overleveled for the boss, but I didn't really find it that much of a challenge. Listening to the soundtrack, it's definitely really nice in its sound, it's pretty epic, but I don't believe that it's one of the most striking examples of some of the best stuff they've put out over the years. Yeah, I believe that it's just a decent boss fight theme. Bloody Figures, don't even remember it, listen to it in the soundtrack, wasn't really all that interesting, just a casual, short, like invader type theme. Yeah, D tier. This fight is incredible, but apart from that, it also has a really good soundtrack, which in my opinion, in its first phase, the way it starts and the way it's building up, it makes for a much more compelling moment than when it actually comes to its second phase, which, yeah, it might sound way more epic and it has some cool moments as well, but it's another one of those tracks that in my opinion after a certain point it overstays its welcome. It didn't really need to be all that big, it doesn't really have that many ideas that are that compelling in order to justify its length, but even with all that being said, still, the introduction out of this is really solid. It has a very strong composition to it, and yeah, I'd say that this is a very low A tier, but still a track that I really enjoyed and I believe that it has some really cool elements to it, especially towards the beginning. Now, on the other hand, Godric the Grafted is a track that, in my opinion, didn't really have that much of a strong first phase, but at least when it comes to the soundtrack, but when it comes to the second phase, the way it starts after the reveal of this badass and insane cutscene, it is so epic. Like the way it starts with those choral parts, it is intense, it is great, it's certainly one of the most memorable and iconic moments out of the entire game. I'd say that this is a really good theme. I'm gonna give it a B tier. Malenia, the Blade of Miquella. This is the theme that I listened to the most because it took me over 150 tries in order to beat Malenia. it took me the most out of every other boss in the game. I mean, yeah, it was a really difficult boss fight, but even with me listening to the soundtrack so many times, it's still one of my favorite themes out of the entire game. It has some of the best elements when it comes to FromSoftware and boss design, and especially when it comes to the soundtrack. It is really mellow, and it's a really nice way to portray the tragic story behind Malenia with a really sad and sober theme that fits really well with the whole theme and the aesthetic of this entire fight. And I like how at the second phase it also becomes really epic, and it also has some really strong highs to it. It's a consistently great piece, not like a masterpiece or anything, but I'd say that this is one of my favorites when it comes to boss themes, starting really strong and also ending on a strong note. I'm gonna give it a strong A. Song of Honor. This basically plays right when you get at the Red Main Castle, if I remember correctly, that's what it was called, the Red Main Castle, before the fight with Radan. At the moment that the Radan festival is going to take place, where you meet all of the NPCs, and this short, minimal choral piece is what it plays in the background. It gave me strong Bloodborne vibes, and I absolutely loved it. Actually, I'd say that this, despite being such a short and straightforward moment, it just works tremendously well. It created a very nice aesthetic, and I believe that it works really nice on its own as a minimal piece. I'm gonna give it a really strong A. Starscourge Radan. Kinda fitting having such an epic theme for such an epic boss fight, but I didn't really remember that track all that much. I just remember it being good and having some nice arrangements and compositions behind it. There's certainly a lot of effort being put into this theme in particular. Not that the others feel cheap or anything, but we're talking about one of the greatest fights in the game. Undoubtedly, they've put a lot of effort into this, and it shows. I would personally hope that the soundtrack would be a little bit better and more memorable, because for me, it's not really doing all that much, and I don't believe that people really find the soundtrack to be like one of the strongest moments. I'd say that the switch up to the second phase is really good, but not something that goes closer to some of the better soundtracks that we see for some of the more significant boss fights as we go on later in the game. I'm gonna give it a B tier because there are some cool moments, but yeah, it's not one of the most memorable soundtracks for me. Recusants is when you do the recusant quest lines where you invade certain NPCs that I didn't even know they had their own theme. I just believe that, they took some of the other themes. Yeah, this is another really forgettable short piece. I'm just gonna give it a D tier. There's not something particularly interesting about it. God Devouring Serpent, one of the greatest, coolest and most badass fights in the game that unfortunately has possibly one of the weakest soundtracks for being one of the main bosses. I'm sorry, but this was really forgettable. I couldn't really get into it. I listened to it like outside of the context of the fight. I mean, you can't really even listen to it that much in the context of the fight because there is so much going on with the sound effects being really loud with all of the explosions and stuff. The theme by itself, I don't really believe that it's one of the strongest. It sounds really basic and generic, and it's kind of unfortunate because, you would expect something more out of this, but no, it's just gonna be a C tier, unfortunately. Renala, Queen of the Full Moon. This is one of the greatest tracks when it comes on showcasing the tragedy behind the story of Renala. Like, the soundtrack by itself, it feels like it speaks to you. It's like a narrative. It's like it's telling you a story. And I think that this is one of the strongest elements when it comes to Elden Ring's music and when it comes to FromSoft's music, communicating the emotions and the struggle that the bosses have gone through over the years or over like millennia, I'd say. Renala is a really cool theme, especially when it comes to the first phase. I believe that combined with the children just casting those spells and having all of those surrounding sounds, it makes for an even more gratifying experience rather than listening to it on its own. And the second phase is not really all that strong. Lots of highlights, some of my favorite elements out of these types of boss fights come into place with this soundtrack, but it's still not one of my favorites. But yeah, it's a pretty good one. I'm gonna give it a strong B. Fire Giant is just slightly frustrating, mainly due to the fact that we're talking about what is meant to be one of the most significant and one of the fights where it seems that they put the most focus on. I'd say that out of the Remembrance bosses, Fire Giant was possibly my least favorite because it suffers from certain parts when it comes to FromSoft making giant enemies, which makes the fights feel more of like an arcade style and not having something that much intriguing mechanically. I believe that it's a great fight, but this soundtrack is so bland and generic, which for such a significant fight, it feels slightly insulting. I believe that this is one of the strongest cases of Elden Ring actually not really providing some of the best when it comes to creating imaginative ideas when it comes to some of its more important boss fights. I'm just gonna give it a strong, the highest D, but yeah, this disappoints me. I would definitely expect more out of this soundtrack, but I listened to it and it's really forgettable. Okay, we're getting close to the end over here. Next up we have Beast Clergyman, which then becomes Malekith. The theme has pretty strong similarities with Crumbling Farmazula. Sonically it's more of like the same with the subtle piano passages, the low tone choral parts, the ambient atmosphere. And in my opinion, I would actually say that when it comes to this version over here, it works even better, it's even more compelling as a composition, and it contains some more intriguing elements to it. Now when it comes to the second phase, we get a much more epic theme, which doesn't really fit all that much with what the track was doing beforehand. It feels like quite a striking difference of mood and sounds, in the sense that you can't really say there's that much of a connection over here, and it's another one of the cases where for some reason the track goes for a very long time. Like the fight itself, especially when it comes to the second phase, kinda requires you to be really fast with it because you're gonna lose health constantly. If it hits you with a certain effect, it would just start draining your health and you're just gonna have to be fast with it. The fight itself wants you to engage in a really fast pace. So having that much content with the soundtrack doesn't really make all that much sense because you're most likely never going to reach those points outside of listening to the soundtrack. Which for me, yep, this is another case where it kind of overstays its welcome. I don't really believe it was necessary for it to go for as long as it did, but at least it has a very strong first phase, one that is filled with a strong sense of atmosphere, and it makes for a really nice way to end this whole thing with Crumbling Farmazula. So I'm gonna give it the top of B tier. Then we have the secret boss of Crumbling Farmazula, which is Dragon Lord Placidosax. This is definitely the coolest design they've done for a dragon in this whole game. Now, this is a special case of a dragon and a fight in the arena that you fight this thing, and I remember that at first glance, at listening to the soundtrack while fighting this thing, I remember that it was quite nice, but listening to it in the context of the soundtrack with everything else surrounding this whole project, I ended up feeling kinda bored with this theme. I mean, it's not like I don't like it, it's not like I find it to be disappointing, but it's another case where I'm like, yeah, this is going on for too long, I'm not really gonna listen to it again, I just like it for what it is, and I believe that they did a good job providing some nice elements when it comes on making this fight feel and sound special. So Dragon Lord Placiduous Axe is gonna be at the top of C tier. Godfrey first Elden Lord. I love this fight. This might be my favorite fight out of this whole game. I love fighting Godfrey, and then the transition to Horalu is chilling. It's impressive, and it makes for one of the most genius fights they've ever done. And thankfully, they created a soundtrack that is really fitting for Godfrey and for Horalu. Both of the phases not really lasting all that long, keeping straight to the point, and both of them sound extremely epic. The Godfrey Sigh has this really epic undertone to it with all of the vocals, the grandiose instrumentation. It really makes you feel like you're fighting with a legend. And then at the second phase, the track gets way more fast paced and intense, giving more of like a threatening aura and fitting with the more aggressive side of Horalu. It is a gorgeous blend of sounds and it gets the job really well done. Godfrey First Elden Lord is definitely one of the best ones when it comes to its soundtrack. It's a really strong one, and I'm gonna give it a high A tier because they really did a good job with this one. The final battle is basically an extension on what we got with the Elden Ring theme right at the beginning. It makes for a really satisfying conclusion if you were anticipating to listen to a more fleshed out version out of this theme, because in my opinion they did a great job on it when it comes to the whole pacing. It makes this whole theme feel way more complete, and it works tremendously for the most part, and it definitely makes for one of the best soundtracks they have ever put in any of those games. The Radagon fight contains the more epic and grandiose moments, which is definitely some of the most memorable stuff they've put out. It has a strong sense of catchy and memorable melodies that are instantly recognizable, and it has a really smooth and nice pacing to it. And finally, we have the Elden Beast, adding this in a much more sorrow and slow tone. It has this very little tears that we got out of Elden Ring theme, with the piano notes that were very reminiscent out of the Gwen Lord of Cinder theme. But here we finally get the full extended version, and they did a great job on this one. They managed to add lots of layers of different instrumentation as the track would go on, with string arrangements and other stuff, making this feel much more fulfilling rather than just a minimal piece playing in the background. And yeah, it is a really powerful, really beautiful, really well done conclusion that fits nicely with the whole arena and how magical the final fight is. Even if the Elden Beast is definitely not one of the most compelling fights when it comes mechanically, the soundtrack and the whole aesthetic is definitely unmatched. It's some of the best stuff they've pulled out, and this is definitely one of the best tracks they've done in any boss fights ever. I'm gonna give it a low S tier because there are many great elements about the final battle. And of course, finally, there's the ending, which is basically the end credits theme, which at the context of the game, it's fine, it just plays in the background, you see all the credits roll. By itself, it's not really doing anything particularly interesting. I mean, it has some nice elements, it's like a compilation of many different sounds that you get throughout the game with different moods. It's pretty standard stuff. I'm gonna give it like a low sitter, and that's basically it. And finally, here it is, the whole thing. Here is my Elden Ring OST tier list. So, as a final verdict, I think that one of the things that keeps the soundtrack in particular as strong as it is that it kept introducing you new sounds and new stuff throughout the entirety of the game. There was not a moment over here that it was silent, and they also did a great job when it comes to the overall mixing. Like, I never had with this particular game any problems when it has to theme playing in the background and having to interact with an NPC dialogue. I think that this is the best one when it comes to the overall sound and mixing. I think that over the years we've seen some significant progress when it comes to the way they've orchestrated all of those themes, with Dark Souls 1 and 2 feeling pretty rough around the edges, but there was still something appealing with the whole direction and aesthetic they were going for. But things changed drastically with Bloodborne, which is the one that felt the most sonically impressive and the one that would feel having the more proper orchestral theme soundtrack. After this point, I believe that we got some really great stuff when it comes to boss fights out of Dark Souls 3 and respective soundtracks. Sekiro, on the other hand, was a soundtrack that I personally expected and wanted more out of it, because I believe that there was the potential for something more. Not that we don't get great themes, but it's definitely the one that I remember to the least. And now Elden Ring has so much stuff to it that it's quite overwhelming. When it comes to boss fights, I was slightly disappointed with some of the themes over here, especially when it comes to some of the main fights. I mean, when it comes to highlights outside of Cutscene Apostles and the final battle, I believe that Dark Souls 1, 3 and Bloodborne had better and more striking highlights when it came to boss fight themes. On the other hand, the fact that we have so many ambient and dark ambient moments over here playing in the background while traversing the multiple open and enclosed areas of the game really puts it up there for making this the most compelling and fulfilling experience FromSoft has done when it comes to a full-on soundtrack on a game. But yeah, overall that's it. I personally love this game. Elden Ring is like a masterpiece for me. It is definitely, after just spending so many hours to it and just loving every moment out of it, there was not really a moment out of this game that I ended up getting bored. So yeah, for me, it's definitely a 10 out of 10 game. There was so many engaging stuff that I could do to this game, and it's just insane what they pulled off with such a massive world that is just so intriguing to experience, and going through it all and trying to find and explore new stuff. Though for me, nothing still beats Bloodborne. It's personally my favorite when it comes to the whole setting and the aesthetic. Nothing can top this still, and even when it comes to the combat style, it definitely feels more engaging and more genius in what they pulled off, especially back in the day. But yeah, Elden Ring is certainly my second favorite FromSoft game, and I'm really looking forward to the DLC when it's going to come out. So yeah, with all that being said, that's all I have with the tier list of the soundtrack. Leave a like if you enjoyed the video, subscribe for more content like this. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video. Goodbye.